Okay, let's get out. Okay. Wait a minute. I gotta get the microphone. Okay, here we go. Let's start the last chapter for exam 3 of chapter 25, fluids and electrolytes. This is a short chapter. You'll be able to cover this chapter in one video. All right, so we're talking about water balance first. Body fluids. In fluid compartments, places in the body where you find fluid. There's intracellular fluid and extracellular fluid. Intracellular fluid is a fluid inside cells. Extracellular fluid is fluid outside cells. And that is three different compartments in the extracellular fluid. One is interstitial fluid. It's a fluid that surrounds cells. Then there's plasma, lymph, and what's called transcellular. And that's a minor fluid compartments like the aqueous humor in your eye, for example. Okay, and so when we look at water balance, we look at water gain and water loss. Right? So we're going to look at that. Here's on page 1001. You can see the intracellular fluid, interstitial fluid, blood plasma, and lymph. And it's important to realize that water goes across all of these compartments, right? All of your cells are permeable to water, except, remember, the ascending loop of Henle. Those cells are never permeable to water. And sometimes the cells lining the collecting duct are also impermeable to water, depending upon whether ADH is present. So they're conditionally permeable to water. So throughout the whole rest of the body, water can flow anywhere across these compartments. Okay. Okay, so this is the important reason why fluid has to be regulated. Why we have to have fluid balance, because you remember those terms: isotonic, hypotonic, hypertonic. Since water can flow between all of these compartments, back and forth, then if the blood is hypotonic, that means water concentration is higher than interstitial fluid. The water will flow out of capillaries into the interstitial fluid, making interstitial fluid more water. That means it's hypotonic to the cells. So water will go into cells, cause them to swell. So there's a danger with drinking too much water. It's called hyponatremia, where you actually drink too much water. And it is actually possible to drink enough water to kill yourself. Not by drowning in it, but by causing your brain cells to swell up and burst. That's what happens in hyponatremia. Other side, the exact opposite. Fluid movement is dehydrated. If the blood turns hypertonic, it will suck water into the cardiovascular system, making the interstitial fluid salty. And that's what draw water out of the cells and cause cells to shrivel up, which could also be lethal. If you get too dehydrated, you can die of dehydration. So we have to look at water gains and losses. How do we gain water? How do we lose water? And so water balance is taking replacing the losses that we have every day. You lose water every day, and you have to replace the water that you lost for water balance. Gains, two places you get water from. You drink the stuff, or you drink any kind of fluids, watery fluids. That's where most of your water comes from. We also have metabolic water. We actually make this stuff. Remember in cellular respiration, the last step in cellular respiration, the used up electrons in electron transport are given to oxygen, and the oxygen gathers a couple of hydrogen ions and forms water. We make about 200 milliliters of water every day. Losses. Well, this is something you could ask. Well, if we make water every day, why do we have to drink this stuff every day? Because we lose more than we make with metabolic water. We only make about 200 milliliters every day. More if you exercise, actually. But then you lose more by sweating if you exercise. Anyways, let's get to the losses. In urine, you have to urinate every day to get rid of metabolic waste. As I think I mentioned during the urinary system lecture, it doesn't matter how dehydrated you get, you have to urinate every day. A minimum of maybe about a half a liter. You lose water in feces. You want feces to be have enough water so they're easily passed. You don't have compacted feces is too dry, and obviously diarrhea is too soft. You want it in between, and you lose about a couple hundred milliliters of water every day through feces. Expired breath. On a cold day, you can tell that the breath is that you're breathing out is full of water vapor, so you lose water vapor in your breath. You sweat. Even if you don't exercise, you still sweat a little bit every day, and so you lose water in that. And what's called cutaneous transpiration, and that is right through your skin. Now, I think we mentioned in the immune system how the skin is a great barrier to infection. It's also quite a barrier to dehydration because it's full of a very hydrophobic protein called keratin. And in fact, that's one of the big problems with burn victims, third-degree burn victims, because dehydration, because the scar tissue that forms over the skin when the skin is destroyed is not that good a barrier to loss of water. But still, even though it's a good barrier to loss of water, you'll still lose some, a little bit. And that's called transpiration, cutaneous through the skin. We can talk about water loss as one, sensible or insensible. This doesn't mean smart and stupid. It means, do you know you're losing water? Or do you not know you're losing water? If you know you're losing it, it's sensible. You can sense I'm losing some water here. If it's insensible, you really can't, although sometimes the insensible ones become sensible. And there's what's called obligatory water loss. That is, you have to lose that water. Like I just said, you have to pee every day. So that's obligatory. You're always going to sweat a little bit. Your breath is always going to be moist. It's obligatory. And we are like a leaky bucket. Where is that leaky bucket? On top of page 1008, in the integrate section, learning strategy, leaky bucket. You put fluid in the bucket, but the bucket leaks. So we have to continuously add water to the bucket because it's going to leak. So we're a leaky bucket. So we regulate our fluid intake by a dehydration osmometer thirst mechanism. So we have osmometers in our brain, in the hypothalamus. It detects the osmolarity of your blood. And the thirst center is in your hypothalamus. As long as and it tells you when you're dehydrated or overhydrated, and so you listen to it. And there's nothing wrong with that mechanism. There's this strange thing. It's being changed now that in even some physiology books and some sports medicine books that we talked about how you gotta make sure that you don't get dehydrated. You drink water all the time, even if you're not thirsty. Because because they say if you get thirsty, it's already too late to dehydrate. Too late for what? It's not a good idea to drink water when you're not thirsty. If you get really dehydrated, you get disoriented, you get weak, you get tired, you get nauseous. What happens if you drink too much water? You get nauseous, you get weak, you get tired. It's exactly the same symptoms. So you don't know which is which. So some people just think that there's something inherently wrong with the thirst mechanism. There isn't. It's just like a mechanism, just like all the rest of the homeostatic mechanisms in the body, blood pressure and pH and so on and so forth. There's nothing wrong with it. Listen to your body. If you're thirsty, drink something. If you're not, don't. This is on top of page 1004, talking about fluid intake on the left, about 2,500 milliliters a day to replace the 2,500 you're losing in the course of a day. So the vast majority is preformed water, you drink and food. At the bottom, you can see the metabolic water, about 200 milliliters. They don't mention that on the leaky bucket strategy on page 1008. I don't know why. Anyway, on the right is the fluid output. And they also have sensible and insensible. And so the urine and feces is sensible. You know you're losing water there. Cutaneous transpiration is definitely insensible. And if you're just sweating a little bit, it's insensible. And of course, the expired air is insensible. But of course, sometimes sweat can become sensible. If you really go in the gym and you're really working out and sweat is dripping off of you, you can tell that I'm losing water. But in the normal course of a day, you can't tell that you're sweating a little bit. So it's most insensible. And then also obligatory and facultative. Obligatory means you are going to lose this no matter what. And that includes all of the fluid output losses, except for facultative urine. As I mentioned, about 500 milliliters is obligatory urine. But if you're well hydrated or you're even overhydrated, then you can release a lot more water, lose a lot more water in the urine, and that's called facultative. Okay, regulation of fluid output. Loss of both sodium and water, aldosterone is your hormone to do that. Like if you lose blood, you'll be secreting aldosterone, you'll save sodium from your filtrate in your kidneys, and you'll bring water with it. But loss of water alone, you're going to be secreting ADH. And this is the difference between fluid imbalance is constant osmolarity and so volume depletion in excess, you lose both salt and water, or you gain salt and water. That doesn't change your blood osmolarity. But changes in osmolarity or dehydration and hypotonic hydration, that is over drinking water or not drinking enough water, that's going to change your blood osmolarity. If you dehydrate, the osmolarity will go up. If you overhydrate, the osmolarity goes down. In fluid sequestration, sometimes fluid is sequestered, edema, is fluid building up someplace. And increased interstitial fluid formation. This happens in inflammation. Remember, the capillaries open up more and you have more interstitial fluid, and that swells. Or it could have decreased reabsorption in capillaries. If I'm not sure how that would happen, but if you had decreased reabsorption, you have some edema going on. And then decreased fluid removal by lymphatic vessels. And this is due to a parasite, a worm that crawls into your lymphatic vessels and blocks them, and that's called elephantiasis. But that doesn't happen in the US. Okay. Oh, sometimes fluid, sometimes in alcoholics, fluid is sequestered in their abdomen, and it's called ascites, where water just comes up because alcoholics don't make very much albumin. Albumin is one of the major plastic proteins that maintains blood osmolarity. So your blood osmolarity goes down if your liver is really damaged. And for some reason, the body doesn't put that in the kidneys to get rid of it. It sequesters it in your abdominal cavity. Okay. So regulation of fluid intake, stimulation of thirst center. What stimulates this thirst center? Decreased saliva production, increased blood osmolarity, or decreased blood pressure. It's going to stimulate your thirst center. Inhibition of thirst center, increased production of saliva, distension of stomach, decreased blood osmolarity, or increased blood pressure. And believe me, I'm just distending your stomach is going to inhibit your thirst center. And the reason for this is if you drink, if you wait, so your blood osmolarity is too high, so you get thirsty, you drink water, you think, okay, well then drink water, that will lower the blood osmolarity. But that's going to take a while. It's going to take a while for the water to be absorbed across your intestine. And if you waited for that signal to happen to turn off if you waited for blood osmolarity to change to turn off the thirst center, you'd actually drink too much and get overhydrated. So the corrective mechanism for that is just distend your stomach. And they've shown this, that they can distend people's stomach when they're thirsty, but not drinking water, but distending it by some other means, and their thirst goes down. So to prevent overhydration. Okay, let's look at electrolytes and non-electrolytes. Electrolytes are substances that dissociate completely in water to form cations and anions. So about sodium, potassium, calcium, so on. Non-electrolytes don't break apart like that. Like glucose is not an electrolyte. Electrolytes double the osmotic pressure. Remember, the osmotic pressure is determined by how many things are dissolved in the water. We put glucose in water. It's one particle. It'll increase the osmolarity if you pour more and more sugar in the water. Salt doubles the osmolarity because when you put salt in water, it breaks up into two particles, sodium and chloride. And that's two particles dissolved, not one. So actually electrolytes have a much greater effect on the osmotic pressure than non-electrolytes. We're going to look at some of the electrolytes and talk about their physiological role and what happens when they get out of balance. So sodium, major extracellular cation. It's really important in excitable cells. Remember, it's the sodium rushing into cells is responsible for the rising phase of action potentials in nerves. How do you regulate sodium? You've got three hormones that help regulate this. Aldosterone will directly affect it by increasing sodium reabsorption. ANP has the exact opposite, will inhibit sodium reabsorption. And ADH really doesn't have anything to do with sodium, but it changes osmolarity. So it can make there be much less sodium in a sense by bringing in more water. And the imbalances are called hyper and hyponatremia. I've already mentioned hyponatremia. It's overhydration. So even though it's way too much water, it's way too, you can look at it, way too little sodium. So hyponatremia really means too little sodium. Hypernatremia, too much sodium. And what, so here is the scale for sodium. Sodium is on page 1009. Aldosterone retains water, sodium and water. ADH just retains water, so it decreases sodium concentration because it makes you take in more water. AMP increases excretion of sodium and water. And so disturbances in sodium are mostly due to changes in cell size. As I mentioned, if your blood is hypertonic, it will suck water out. If you got too much sodium, it will suck water out of cells. If there's too little sodium outside, water will enter cells. And it has to do with blood pressure. So mostly sodium affects cell size and blood pressure. It's strange it doesn't have any neurological symptoms, even though it's the ion that goes into neurons to cause a rising phase reactive potential. There are no really neurological consequences of sodium imbalance. Potassium, major intracellular cation, and it is controlled by aldosterone, just like sodium, but in the opposite direction. Remember, if aldosterone is present, you lose potassium. If aldosterone is not present, you gain potassium. Imbalance is called hyper and hypokalemia, and these have neurological consequences, really serious neurological consequences. If remember, potassium is what brings action potential, the repolarization phase of action potentials. And so if you disturb, and that depends upon the potassium concentration gradient. So if you decrease the sodium, the potassium concentration gradient, cells won't repolarize as rapidly as they should. And if you make it even greater concentration gradient, then they repolarize too rapidly. So that it has neurological consequences. Chloride functions just like sodium. Chloride always follows sodium, so it's the same thing as regulation of sodium. Here's potassium, and this is on page 1010. So potassium intake, potassium output by aldosterone causes K secretion by kidneys and excretion in urine, and decreases potassium plasma concentration, aldosterone. And this is what happens if you have hyperkalemia. Too much potassium will enter cells, too much potassium exits cells if blood potassium decreases. Also, potassium has a role in maintaining blood pH, because if potassium leaves cells, hydrogen ion goes into cells and will raise the pH outside cells and lower the pH inside cells. Same thing if if there's too much potassium outside, potassium enters cells, hydrogen and ion will now leave cells. And because they're both cations, and that will they'll lower outside pH and raise inside pH. And also, interesting enough, insulin increases movement of both glucose and potassium into cells. This is kind of a little known thing about insulin. Calcium functions. What are the functions of calcium? Wow. Remember, it's a trigger for all muscle contraction. It's vital for synaptic transmission, and it forms most of our bone are calcium phosphate salts. Its homeostasis is parathyroid hormone, calcitriol, which is vitamin D, and calcitonin, which is also made by the thyroid gland. So PTH raises blood calcium, so does calcitriol. Calcitonin lowers blood calcium. Imbalances, crossover with sodium. It has neurological consequences because this crossover with sodium means that all these ions have in nerve cells have their own how can I forget this? Channels, have their own channels, the sodium channels, the potassium channels, there's calcium channels. And sodium and calcium are pretty much the same size. And so there's a little bit of slop with sodium channels. In the sense that some calcium comes in the sodium channels because there's a similar size and they're both cations. And so, the system, so your nerve cells are set up to deal with that little bit of slop. So if you have too much calcium around, then you get too much crossover and you get cells too excited. Not enough calcium around, there isn't enough slop, and cells won't be as stimulated as they should be. Okay. But calcium imbalances are pretty rare. This is hypo and hypocalcemia because you got this huge reservoir of calcium in your skeletal system. And if you don't get enough calcium, your body will take it from your skeletal system. You weaken your bones, but that's not as bad as getting calcium imbalances. Phosphate, remember, it's in bone as well. It's important in nucleic acids and ATP. Its homeostasis is the same, is linked to calcium. And PTH raises blood calcium, lowers blood phosphate. Calcium and phosphate go together, go in opposite directions, just like sodium and potassium. Remember, you can't put too much, remember, calcium is more concentrated on the outside of cells, phosphate on the inside. And you can't put a lot of sodium and phosphate together because you reach what's called the solubility product. You're doing that last semester in the skeletal system, that makes bone. If you put too much calcium and phosphate in the same place, you start making bone, where you might not want to make bone. Okay, acid-base balance. A buffer is something that minimizes a pH change. We got buffers all over our body because pHs are really important homeostatic variable. You got the bicarbonate buffer system in blood. You got phosphate and protein buffers in cells. That phosphate is mostly found in cells, and protein in cells, and protein in blood plasma. They're buffers. Okay. Now, so if you want to carry, acid to your kidneys you carry in a buffer. So if you add acid to blood plasma, it doesn't change as much as if the buffer wasn't there. So, and there's two systems that help control pH. One is renal, and one is respiratory. We already talked about the respiratory control of pH. Your breathing rate is determined by your blood pH, by how much CO2 is it. You want to get just rid of them enough CO2 to maintain blood pH. But renal control pH is even more important than that, because you can compensate for a pH change by changing breathing rate, but you can't get rid of excess hydrogen ion or excess bicarbonate. Only the kidney can do that. You can get rid of hydrogen ion by secreting it. And usually, as I think I've already said in the urinary chapter, mostly urine is acidic because we generally have more of an acid load than a base load. And so we're generally always secreting hydrogen ion. Our kidneys are to get excess acid and put it into the urine. The limiting pH, your pH range is usually from 4.5 to 8. It's usually acidic, and it can't get lower than 4.5. You can't let your filtrate in your kidneys get less than 4.5. That's called the limiting pH, because below, if the pH of your filtrate gets below that, you cannot secrete hydrogen ion, and you can't get rid of excess acid. So it would be dangerous. So what happens is there's an ammonium ion buffer in the filtrate that will prevent filtrate from getting lower than 4.5. So your urine will never be lower than 4.5. Okay. So here, on pages page 1020, look at increased but hydrogen ion concentration, decreased pH. How does that happen? Various acids in food, lactic acid, keto acids, by metabolism. They get put into blood. That stimulates hydrogen's ion secretion from these type A cells in your collecting ducts. If you have decreased blood hydrogen ion concentration, increased pH, you can get that from a vegetarian diet or from loss of hydrogen ion by vomiting. Then they'll stimulate type B cells, which will secrete bicarbonate and absorb hydrogen ion. And then respiration rate, remember, can adjust pH changes. If your blood becomes too alkaline, your breathing rate will go down. If your blood becomes too acidic, your blood pressure, your breathing rate will go up to blow off more CO2. Now, this is on page 1026. I should mention on pages 1017, aldosterone. You should look at that figure 2510 to know aldosterone. We talked a lot about that. Atrionatriated peptide on page 1028. You should look at that. And finally, look at pages 1014 and 1015 to look at the renin-angiotensin system, Remember this, they identify low blood pressure, the kidneys secrete renin, that converts angiotensinogen into angiotensin 1. It goes to the lungs, and the lungs have ACE to convert angiotensin 1 and angiotensin 2. And angiotensin 2 has several effects that are going to raise blood pressure. It causes systemic blood vessels to constrict. It decreases GFR in the kidneys. It makes you thirsty, so you drink more. And it stimulates the secretion of aldosterone. And then also, make sure you know about ADH on page 10 of 15, secreted by your posterior pituitary, and it makes the collecting tubular walls permeable to water, so you conserve water. You definitely have these hormones on the exam, so it's important that you know those. And here, as you can see, that the ubiquitous equation that links blood CO2 to blood pH. So you can just, like I said, you can compensate. Oh yeah, that's right. Acid-base disorders. Acidosis below 7.35. And that can be caused by a respiratory problem or a metabolic problem. When it's metabolic, it's something wrong with the kidney. So if something is wrong with the kidney and you're not getting rid of enough acid, you could go into what's called metabolic acidosis. It's a problem in the respiratory system. You're not breathing enough or deeply enough. That would be a respiratory acidosis. Above 7.5 is alkalosis. So it's too basic. And again, something wrong with the respiratory system, you're breathing too rapidly. It's respiratory alkalosis, or something wrong with the kidneys, and you're not resorbing enough bicarbonate. Or you're resorbing too much bicarbonate, or you're not. Then your blood becomes acid, alkalosis, and that would be metabolic alkalosis. And these two systems can compensate for each other. If there's something wrong with your kidneys, you can adjust your breathing rate to compensate for that. If there's something wrong with your lungs, your kidneys can compensate for it. And but remember, the kidney system is more important because it's the out of two systems, it's the only one that can actually get rid of excess acid or get rid of excess base. Your respiratory system can just adjust your breathing rate to compensate for that. But in order to get rid of those things, you need the renal system. And that's all she wrote for the, so this is kind of a longer than normal to cover the whole chapter, but I think we're all set. So for the material for exam 2. Okay. So long for now.